welcome back to my doll collecting channel. Today we're going to be talking about some ideas I have for historical American boy doll ideas. So I was talking to the Doll Studio by Chris, and he posted this image on his Instagram, and before he released it, he released a sneak peek on his Instagram story, and it just got me thinking about if American Girl released more boy dolls. And since the historical dolls are my favorite, I thought I would create a list of cool ideas for boy dolls that American Girl could release that were historical characters. First off, these are just rough ideas, just, little ideas that I've come up with, and they're not fully fleshed out ideas. And, who knows? Maybe American Girl will take this idea and apply it to their line like they have done other things in their collection. And you've probably heard me talk about this before, but the whole Covey Sherma Theater Kid Girl of the Year incident, and then now they're releasing Wicked costumes, which I talked about in my last long form video. Now, the very first doll that I think would be really beneficial if they decided to do American Boy line is an Indigenous Boy doll, also known as, Native American, but Indigenous is, the more popular term at the moment, I guess I could say. But I would love an Indigenous boy doll because I've even thought about making my own custom Indigenous boy doll. I just think it would be kind of difficult with making the outfits and stuff like that. I don't have the skills for that yet, but it would be so cool to see a different Indigenous culture than Kaya, because I have mentioned in my previous videos that by just having Kaya as the only Indigenous representation from American Girl, it kind of creates this, and the fact that she's historical kind of creates this impression that all Indigenous cultures across North America, or I guess I should say Turtle Island, is the same, and that it's one culture, when really the Indigenous community, I guess I should say, is built up of many different nations. By creating one doll is creating the impression that this is what all Indigenous people across North America were like, which is not true. Also, by having Kaya exclusively as a historical, kind of creates this impression that Indigenous people lived in the past and that they no longer exist, which is not true. Still around, and people still identify as Indigenous and still have Indigenous things like powwows and ceremonies, and so the Indigenous community is still around. And by creating a character, by creating an Indigenous character and only having an Indigenous character from the past, it's kind of creating this impression that Indigenous people don't exist anymore. I would love a Indigenous character who was a Girl of the Year or World by Us. I think World by Us would be a great opportunity to talk about Indigenous issues to children. But this video was just talking about historical boy dolls. So I think an Indigenous boy doll would be a very, very cool perspective, especially if he came from a culture different from Kaya's culture. So in my notes, I wrote Anishinaabe, which you may know as Ojibwe, but the reason I wrote Anishinaabe is because they're one of the nations that I know more, and they live in the Ontario area of Canada, and then northern parts of the United States. Hopefully I can find a map here. So some states, I think they might have been in Michigan or something. I don't know. But they were in some northern states around kind of the Great Lakes area. This culture is quite different from Kaya's culture. Kaya was from kind of the West Coast Plains area, if I remember correctly. If American Girl did release another Indigenous character, I would love for them to be from kind of the eastern side of North America, so kind of in the woodlands area, because that would be the Indigenous people there have very different traditions and language structures and things like that. So it would be kind of cool to see that perspective from a completely different Indigenous culture. Also, to point out that Indigenous people have been around for, when I was in high school, they said 15,000 years Indigenous people have been in North America. Last year, and I learned this by studying anthropology, they now think that number is around 150,000. So Indigenous people have been here for a long time, so there's lots of time that you could cover. And every day they're finding new evidence of how Indigenous people lived, and there's just so many things that you can draw from at different eras. Also, I'm currently taking an Indigenous education class, and I was talking to my mom about the class and some things that I'm learning in that class, and my mom was telling me that they discovered an Anishinaabe settlement which housed 40,000 people, so that's like a decent city, along the Lake Ontario region, kind of, I think, near Toronto. Just think of Lake Toronto if you know where Toronto is. I don't think it was in Toronto exactly, but it was on the same lake, and it had 40,000 Indigenous people. So that was a big community, and it was a big trading area for the Indigenous people to trade along the lakes. So that might be a cool place for him to live. Again, it is Canada, but I'm sure there was other settlements around that area that he could live in if it wants to be more American. But I think some accessories that he could have is some ceremonial regalia, which is the proper, I guess, outfits that Indigenous people wear to ceremonies and things like that. It's very important that you don't use the word costumes when referring to things like this, because that's seen kind of as disrespectful, because it isn't a costume. It has great significant importance to the community, so make sure that you use the word regalia if you need to. I would love some ceremonial regalia specific to the Anishinaabe people. And it would be really cool if there was a Longhouse playset, which would be very big. But if American Girl could release the dollhouse, the Kids Craft dollhouse, I think they can release a little Longhouse. That would be really cool. Next, we have a really cool concept, and after I wrote it, I don't know if this is just a specific Canadian thing or if this happened in the United States as well, but it would be really cool if they had a boy doll who was involved with the fur trade. So if you don't know what the fur trade is, it's essentially before Canada and North America were settled. I mean, there was a few settlements, but nothing crazy. Europeans came over to trade with Indigenous hunters for things like beaver and brought it back to Europe to sell like beaver hats and things like, or beaver top hats and things like that. So it was very profitable, and some people view it as a collaboration between Indigenous people and the Europeans. Some people say it's a little bit more complex than that. It'd be really cool if there was a boy doll who was around during the early days of American history, and I even thought about making him maybe best friends with the Indigenous boy doll I talked about before. I don't know, American Girl is moving away from the best friends line, but if they did go back to it, or I don't know, I just thought it was an idea if you could make the fur trading or early settler boy friends with the Indigenous boy and kind of model a good relationship between Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities. If they did a lot of research on that and talked with Indigenous people to kind of model a relationship and a friendship between Indigenous communities and non-Indigenous communities. And I use the word relationship, and I know people in the comments are going to think that I mean romantic relationship. I really do not. I mean relationship in the terms of, two people, communicating and working with each other. Next, we could have a boy doll who was from the Revolutionary War. Now, this would be really cool, and American Girl could definitely lean into the patriotism that is very prevalent in the United States, and I don't know if Americans really realize it until they're out of it, or if you're Canadian and you're looking on the outside and you're like, wow, they're very patriotic. But I think this doll, if boys weren't interested in history, they might be interested in the Revolutionary War and maybe some of the war aspects of it. Also, when creating this list, I tried to keep things in mind about like what boys would find interesting. So I was keeping that in perspective of what boy doll collectors would find interesting versus like boy dolls for girls, if that makes sense. I mean, obviously any gender could play with any gender of doll, and that's fine. But I was just thinking of, like, if American Girl wanted to branch out and market it towards boys, here's some of the things they could do. So I think the Revolutionary War could be very interesting. I mean, I would love to see some of the outfits they would come out for this, because I love the 1700s. But I think it would be really cool if there was a boy doll who could, like, somehow, you know, to quote Hamilton, get in the room where it happens and see some of these things, or get a hold of information about the early days of America, and maybe in the room or snuck into the room with the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and kind of creating this, like, adventure story would be really cool, and I think interesting to me, obviously, but I'm a grown adult. But I think maybe even a 9-year-old boy would read a story about the American Revolution if it was like an adventure story and was educational and historic. So a Revolutionary War boy doll would be very cool. Next, we have a doll that would be like a Victorian boy doll, and I would love for him to solve mysteries similar to, like, Sherlock Holmes. Kind of cheesy, but oftentimes when I think of the Victorian era, one of the things I think about is Sherlock Holmes and solving mysteries, and maybe even like Agatha Christie kind of style things. I don't know when Agatha Christie released her stuff, but like Murder on the Orient Express. Now that I'm thinking about it, I'm like, okay, but where would he live in the United States? Like, I would say like New York, but Samantha, Rebecca, and Claudie are all from New York. But that seems to be the place where everything's happening. But maybe he could be somewhere else. I don't know. If you have any ideas of where a Victorian Sherlock Holmes type boy would live, I mean, London seems like an obvious choice, but this is American boy dolls, so I don't know. Maybe he could travel between the both. Maybe he's from one place, but he travels to London and then solves a crime or something. That might be cool, because we had Grace, and she traveled from America to France, so maybe we could have the boy doll travel to England. And it would just be really cool seeing some of the Victorian outfits for the Victorian boy doll. I think that would just be really cool. Another topic that I think boys would find really interesting is the Titanic. I've seen so many books written for boys about the Titanic. I mean, girls like the Titanic too. Like, it feels like a lot of people love the Titanic, and not just because of the movie. People love learning about things that went wrong. So it'd be really cool if we had a boy doll who survived the Titanic. Again, another kind of adventure story. He could be on the ship and he survived, and, you know, had to deal with the ocean and dealing with that sort of thing. And then maybe he gets on land and he has to deal with all these interviews and people wanting to talk to him, and just dealing with the emotions. And that, now that I'm thinking about it, maybe this could be a good opportunity for them to teach about like trauma and dealing with emotions, and how to express your emotions properly, which I think might be a good message for boys to hear, that they can express emotions and they can cry, and that might be a beneficial lesson to teach them through this story. But who knows? So I think a Titanic boy would be very interesting. Another concept that I think would do really well if American Girl did release historical boy dolls would be a World War II boy. Now, technically, American Girl has 3 characters from World War II. And we have Molly, and then her best friend Emily was a doll, and then we have Nanea. And this kind of just goes to show that World War II is a very popular topic for people who like history. And it'd be very cool to see this from a boy's perspective. I don't know if it would be a good idea for him to be, you know, accidentally involved in the war and the war front. That might be a little bit too much. That would, of course, be very interesting from educational adventure background too. But I think it would just be interesting to hear kind of a World War II narrative from a boy's perspective, and maybe his older brother goes off to fight and he has to deal with the emotions of that, and his dad and things like that. So that might be an interesting topic to cover. But if you like this video, make sure to subscribe for more American Girl doll videos such as these, like I almost said conspiracy theories. Maybe we should call it a conspiracy theory because then it sounds really dramatic, but no, theories about American Girl and American Girl doll news. Also, make sure to follow my Instagram and TikTok, and I will see you all with another video in the future. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.